and hard chicken fingers. He was not happy. We waited half a...
Okay. He sees all. Yes, Hasanabi will soon become a Shakespeare a Shakespeare viewer. I must find this. I must find the purveyor of these Habsburgs. Um, which is really funny too, because I actually, so today's kind of like a stressful day for me because I now am starting on the next chapter of my book. And let me tell you, the Habsburgs come into it. The Habsburgs play a part, right? And I'm just like, oh, like, I just thought like the whole Habsburg chin thing. And I'm just like every time I read, like, oh, there was a dispute between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. I don't know, it's just great. It's just great. Because I just imagined that face that I sent you. It's really good though. I like it. I mean, I think to me it's like the perfect image for Habsburg chin emote. Plus it like matches the like, I don't want to say like the vibe of the stream, but it kind of does. Like it can't like it couldn't be like just a chin, right? It had to be that face. Like that face is just perfection. So for today, like I said, I started writing I'm literally having like I feel like anxiety right now because I literally just stopped writing. So, and I'm like, I better stream because I know if I talk about history stuff, then I'll feel better, right? Because when you're writing history stuff, I doubt myself so much. I'm like, did I cite this correctly? I'm like, when I'm talking about this or that, like, oh, am I like, because like one thing about telling history or to write history is that it requires interpretation, right? And so that's why let me turn this down a little bit more. That is why I'm kind of like, on one hand, I like the fact that, I've done so much research. I've been, and thank you also to Iron Orchid for getting me the Reification of Desire. Again, like when people help me with these books, like, honestly, it's like a huge anxiety is lifted off of me because, I take copious notes. I write all over my books. Because again, like when you're writing history, what matters is the texts, right? Like historians work with texts in particular. And so for me, having like the definitive book on this or that, like the book up here, or the book up, there, right? Jews and Jewish Identity in Latin America, like these books are groundbreaking. And so my book, oh gosh, I'm like, I always feel like there's no way I could ever like reach that level because it's just so hi Yokio, it's so good to see you. Hello. Yes, we are. So anyway, so I saw this video earlier that was talking about how, so I forget who it was. I think it was Polly was sort of going over the fact that Don Jr., right? Don Jr., I think that's his name, right? The one that's like really weird. Well, I guess they're all really weird. But anyway, that he's like, oh, I don't want my kids to speak Spanish. And people were saying like, oh, like what if you wanted to learn Spanish? Or what if you... And as someone who once was a language teacher, right, although this was in French, and it was sort of different because it was focused instead on adults, right? It was focused instead on, people who were already professionals who wanted to know it for, like, if they're lawyers or if they're, professionals, right, of any sort. So it was a very different experience from, say, teaching at a college level. But after talking with like Elise a long while ago, we might have to schedule another talk soon to talk about her current project again. Um, I thought about, in America, when people think of Spanish, they usually think of a particular kind of Spanish, right? And that is either the Spanish that is spoken in South Texas, that has a historical separate, right? Like it's been culturally separated from, as we know, there are different dialects of every language, right? So, you know, like for example, in the United States, people might say, like speaking about a carpet, right? They might call it carpeta, right? Carpeta. But in official Spanish, right? Like that is to say, in the dictionary, right, and all of that stuff, academically speaking, that does not mean carpet. We already have words for that: tapete, alfombra, etc. The word carpeta means folder. Like clam ops folders that we often talk about the historical famous file cabinet saleswoman, no comment chick, right? Um, but so yeah, so there are these, and another thing is like there are a lot of these like Americanisms that have been placed within certain forms of Spanish, but there also is Spanglish, right? There's Spanglish too, and there's also something that's called caló, which is even more of a almost like a Creole. I would almost want to characterize it as that. So essentially, linguistically in America, people would think that it's becoming more homogenous, but actually, even with the English language itself in the United States, it's actually separating off into more and more distinct accents and dialects. But I wanted to focus on the Mexican dialect because, one, it's often confused with one type of Mexican Spanish dialect, which is the northern dialect. So up here, like right along the United States border, where, for example, like we know how like in Australia they will say the C word, and to them, although I won't necessarily say that this is a pass, but they will use terms that we find insulting in the United States, right, that are too far gone. In the northern part of Mexico, you have an interesting shift in pronunciation where the ch sound, right, the ch sound, right, becomes like the French sh sound. So you'll hear people, especially if they grew up in more rural areas of northern Mexico or originate from those places, have more of a distinction when it comes to saying like Charles. They'll say Charles instead of Charles, right? Or they'll say, other things along those lines, rancho instead of rancho, right? And these are affected by, one, of course, the indigenous languages of the area, because remember, Mexico, it's not all indigenous. Like the indigenous peoples that live in where my family's from are very different from the ones that from the indigenous peoples from where I lived when I was growing up in Mexico, right? Like where my family is from is one thing, but where I lived, it became very common in the 80s and 90s to move to the border towns. The border town that I lived in, Tijuana, that's my hometown. It has a different relationship with its indigenous peoples, for one. And two, because it's right next to California, it also just has a lot of Anglicisms, a lot of Americanisms in it. But anyway, I mean to do this as a preface to say that, one, when people say Mexican Spanish, they mean, right, or rather they should mean a complex diversity of dialects that exist throughout the country, right? Moreover, is that they are also culturally and socially dependent upon one another. That is to say that because of Mexico City's connection both to having a larger indigenous population around it, but also being the central base of the Spanish Empire. Octavio Paz actually argues in his book, Las Trampas de la Fe, that New Spain was literally that. It was a new Spain. Like, it was a full-on society, completely modeled on... it wasn't like a far-off colony that just had some colonists living, you know, on the littoral, right, like the coast, and like, no, like, essentially, Mexico became as Spanish as anywhere in Spain. That's kind of his argument, historically speaking. I would say that there is a huge element of that, especially if you've traveled to countries like Italy, for example. Like, you will see a lot of similarities if you travel around Mexico, but I don't like comparing it that way, because then it tries to efface, in my opinion, as a historian, the indigenous attributes as well, by comparing it just to Europe. Like, oh yes, it's a new Spain, right? Like, yeah, sure, but also the indigenous peoples are still there, right? They're still part of the culture. They, you know, we still say like San Juan de Apostotlan, right? You know, like, we don't just say San Juan, right? So one is to recognize the influence of the indigenous peoples, and also of other groups, like, for example, the British colony of Belize, right, with certain African, because of the slavery that happened in Belize, also Jamaica as well, but Cuban, Spanish, which also is, you know, varieties too. But when most people think Mexican Spanish, they think of northern Mexican Spanish, particularly because it's one that they associate with, you know, with the ranchero culture, the ranchero music, etc., etc. And that's not a mistake, so to speak, right? In fact, it makes sense if we think about how the United States literally stole not only the land, but also the culture that was on the land. Like, again, buckaroo is the anglicization of the word vaquero, right? And, you know, vaquero also is where we get cowboy from. Like, all of the ranching practices and everything that, like, in Texas that they like, and they like to do and claim it's kind of like, oh, originally ours, is not true. England did not have, and nor did New England have, that same culture ever, right? Whereas Spain does have a history of having, because it's a much more drier, hotter country as well. But also its experiences with trade in the Middle East, etc., etc. So, again, right, like, that's why bullfighting is still a thing in Mexico. I personally disapprove of it, and I hope that I don't know, right now, it's politically, there's a lot of things, and I know I'm kind of going off on like a million tangents, but I was just writing a whole bunch of history, so, you know, it's kind of like, my mind's all over the place. I hope that that's all right. So, one of the things that sort of came to mind was, we're going to watch this video, where it's the Lang Focus channel, and, you know, he's known for, you know, always doing these, like, oh, what is the difference between, you know, Farsi and Dari, right? Hello, Shay April. I'm well. How about yourself? How do you do? Because that's what howdy means. How do you do? Interestingly enough, in English, when people ask you how, you know, oh, I'm so glad to hear that, Shay April. Welcome to the stream. Very glad to have you. So, as I said, we're going to talk about the notorious Spanish that is spoken in Mexico. And we're going to sort of go in depth into why I think that's probably not the right way to say it. Like, I think it's notorious for specific reasons, not because of anything that that Paul says, but just to keep that in mind.
Spanish is one of the most widely spoken languages in the world and functions as an official language in 20 countries. The most populous Spanish-speaking country by far is Mexico, with over 120 million people. Today we're going to focus on Mexican Spanish. The Spanish language came to Mexico with the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors in the 16th century. Prior to their arrival, the Aztec Empire ruled much of the area of central Mexico. The Aztecs consisted of different ethnic groups that spoke the Nahuatl language, including the Mexica. The Spanish defeated the Aztec Empire in the year 1521 and established their colonial presence.
Okay, so this is the thing when people do historical overviews, is that I'm always like, but we need to just like add a little bit more of the like actual history. Oh, thank you so much, Iron Orchid. Thank you for your 3-month streak. Thank you so much. Yes, Viva la Mexico. Let's go. So the Spanish actually were a minority in the colonization process. Yes, they were the ones that eventually colonized the entire, but literally the Spanish, there was a lot of myths about the colonial. One is that they thought that, I'm working now, so I must change my night hour to daytime hours a little bit. Oh, okay, no worries. But that's good that you're working now. Yeah, like for me now, I guess my job is technically to stream. But, technically, because I'm, starting a new chapter, literally. But anyway, so yeah, good morning to you as well. I hope that Hawaii's that Hawaii is, it's a nice day in Hawaii, I should say. Because in Mexico City, I saw that the volcano is still erupting. Popocatépetl is still erupting. A little, somewhat. It's not as bad as it was before, but still, volcanoes. So the Spanish didn't conquer the Mexica by themselves. Like, really, it was the Tlaxcala and other indigenous peoples that they had aligned themselves with that helped them take over Tenochtitlan, right? So, again, it's not to be too, but I do think it's important to recognize that, the Spanish didn't themselves conquer, right, by themselves the Mexica. It was a coalition of other indigenous peoples, right? Some of whom were entire nations, like the Tlaxcala, who eventually got their own land grant from the Spanish Empire, which is now the state of Tlaxcala, and you can see the influence of the fact that they were able to keep more of their indigenous traditions than the people that lived in. Every gay is a good day living in Madame Pele's home. Every day is a good day living in Madame Pele's home. No, I totally get that. I don't know if I think I have mentioned that, the two volcanoes, one of which is erupting, and one of which is always dormant and is always covered in snow. It's like Mexico's Romeo and Juliet story, kind of. Yeah, gay is a good day. That's true. We strive for gay days every single day. Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl were lovers, right? And then Iztaccíhuatl passes away, and Popocatépetl is crying, right? Takes her up to where the volcanoes now are, and then they became the volcanoes, right? I really cut that really short because, there are some versions that are longer, some versions that are, placed during the conquest. Some are placed far further back in Mexica history, but the gist is the end of Romeo and Juliet, right? Essentially. So again, yes, they did establish their colonial presence, but it was only because of other indigenous peoples being their allies. And this is actually important because Nahuatl, but also other words, right, influence how Spanish in Mexico is spoken. For example, if you go to pretty much everywhere else in the Spanish-speaking world, right, the Hispanosphere, I guess. Noise. Madam got drunk and mad at her sister. Now the island happened. No, but see, I love those stories though. I love it because it's it says a lot about different things, right? because like the Mexica were like really, like it shows that that like these European concepts, right? Like one like anger or whatever, that like Zeus or whatever deity that the Europeans might have had, right? That it's like, it shows a kind of like common humanity, I think, but also a unique idiosyncratic way of interpreting it too. So anyway, because it's like most people like in Europe, I don't think volcanoes are necessarily seen as a positive, right? Like when we think Pompeii, we think negative, right? Like unless you know what they found at Pompeii and the museum that's at Pompeii, which I kid you not, literally it's Il Museo de la Pornografia. Like I'm not even joking. It's like the first thing they found was a lot of naughty stuff. I'll just put it like that. Like a lot of naughty stuff. Like Pompeii was kind of like, I guess, what people think Las Vegas is, I guess. But anyway, whereas like Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, like it's not, there's no equivalent to that story.
At the time called New Spain. Of course, the Spanish-speaking presence grew, but Nahuatl continued to be widely spoken for a long time, and even today around 1.7 million people still speak Nahuatl. As a result of language contact, Nahuatl had some influence on Mexican Spanish.
This fountain here, I wish it still existed. There's a metro stop called Salto de Agua, and that's what it used to be. It used to be this beautiful fountain. Almost, it to me, like when I've seen drawings of it, I think it actually looks nicer than the Trevi fountain, but it's just smaller. Because there's more like it's a very nice ornamentation, whereas like the Trevi fountain, it's kind of like you just see Poseidon, right, and all of that stuff. But anyway, I don't know. I mean, like I've seen both. I mean, I've seen representations of both, and both are beautiful. The volcano's like a living god here, so is the ocean and everything else with the volcano. Yeah, so I mean, it's in the same way, in a lot of Mexican beliefs, even some that are syncretized with, say, Roman Catholicism, you have a lot of that. Like, for example, like Huitzilopochtli, right, who is the sun god, right, and also like a warrior god. He's represented by El Colibri, or the hummingbird, right? And you would think like, because when we think of, say, Mars, or Aries, right, when talking about the European ones, right, or even in another sense Hephaestus, right, it's like Hephaestus is like, well, one, he's described as being like unsightly, so that's why Venus cheats on him. But anyway, but like a lot of that like embeddedness of like my northern node is in Aries. Okay, that's cool. I honestly don't know, like, because of the fact that I've always celebrated my birthday according to the Jewish calendar, it moves around so much that I'm like, I can be like 3 different signs depending on what year it is. Because when Jewish people have a leap year, we get an extra month. We don't get like one day, we get an extra month. So it kind of like, it's why, like, when people ask them, like, I honestly have no idea. Like, honestly, I have no idea about most of that stuff. But Huitzilopochtli, like, his symbol is the hummingbird, right? And you think of it as being like very small and right, but the whole point, it's not compatible with the Greco one that's developed over time. Especially because it also was changed when it was changed over from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. So there's that too, right? Like, But anyway, it's a whole different story. Although there is a way how Jewish people do have like this will describe like your year, right? If that makes sense, kind of like in an astrological thing. right? But it has to do with the Tehillim, which means the Psalms. So you read your age plus 1 year, right? And that's supposed to describe that year to you, like whenever whenever it's Rosh Hashanah usually, or your birthday, depending. I don't know, because on some people, some sects of Judaism focus on Rosh Hashanah, like that's the new year. So you read it for that, your age in that new year. But most of the time it's done by like when your birthday is, right? Like, because now you're 26 or now you're 27, right? So then you would read Psalm 28 if you were 27, for example. And whatever is described in there somehow will take root in, you know, the year to come, so to speak. But anyway, so again, like, you know, yeah. Anyway, also, like, if you find like there was in Gaza actually, there's a synagogue there, and in fact it was because they found the synagogue that the Zionists tried to use it as an excuse for why they were colonizing the Gaza Strip at the time. It's still there. It's still protected. I mean, if it was ever going to be destroyed, it'd probably be by, interestingly enough, you know, Israel itself. But point being, hello, Robin's Nest. How are you? It's so good to see you. Welcome to the stream. So anyway, at this, in this particular synagogue, it has like, the menorah, right? Like the candelabra, right? Which, as I explained before, it can be called menorah. Oh, it's your brother today? It's your birthday today? And also, when Paul says there was an influence on Mexican Spanish, the influence is huge. Like, I can't even explain to you how immense it is. Like, even certain specific, it's your birthday. Yeah, no worries. Happy birthday, Robin's Nest. Happy birthday. Yes, happy brother. So like, even something very specific like a tomato, right? Which in most Spanish-speaking countries is tomate, right? Sometimes in Mexico we say jitomate because that comes from the Nahuatl original word, because tomatoes are originally from Mexico. And in fact, it was Jewish people that actually brought the tomato back to Europe, and in particular took it back to the Italian peninsula, which eventually gave rise to, you know, red sauce and all that stuff. I'm a Virgo, but I'm bad at it. Yeah, I don't know. Like, it's always been such a mystery to me, because it's like, well, it depends on which year. Like, I know some people base it on the year of your birth, but it's like also the Jewish years are different, right? Like, it's 2023, right, in the secular calendar, but it's 5783 in the Jewish calendar. So, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, kind of like interesting. It's like, you know, I'm like living in the future, but also like not, you know.
As it developed. It's far from being the only indigenous language.
So one thing I want to make sure that, I'm glad that he actually, oh, Romeo, wherefore art thou, Romeo? Deny thy father and refuse thy name, and if thou will not be but sworn my love, and I'll no longer be a Capulet. How's it? Oh, I'm doing very well, Adadak. It's so good to see you. It's so good to see you. Depends on where you can be on the cusp and all that stuff, yeah. And it's like Jewish days function differently than secular days, right? Because European days start like at midnight, but Jewish days start, like, this is why Jewish holidays start at sunset or the evening before, right? Because a day is from when the day like the day ends, right? The day ends. Yeah, it's based on the moon and everything. Yeah, exactly. it's more based on the moon. It's based on both the moon and sun, which is why it's not like the Islamic calendar. The Islamic calendar, that's the reason why Ramadan can happen in summer, but it can happen in winter. And you really, I mean, because obviously because it's solely based on the lunar system. That's the reason why, like, people that have to do Ramadan in summer, often it's much harsher on them, because you can't drink water, you can't eat anything until you have the date to break the fast, right? So anyway, so as I was saying, oh, you're reading a book about astrology? Oh, nice. That's always cool. So one thing I wanted to make sure that's kind of like made clear here is that this map, which I realize for some reason it cuts off a little bit. Let me see if I can raise. Nope, not working. Anyway, well, the point being that there are more languages down here, like Zapotec and everything, because the further south you go in Mexico, the more indigenous, right? The more indigenous you will notice the cultures and tend to contain more of their indigenous roots, as opposed to if you go to the north, which was again mostly desert. Like if you go this is where ranching culture really started, right? Where there tends to be a lot fewer indigenous peoples, but there still are many, like the Papago or like the Kumeyaay, etc. Or the Kickapoo. I know Americans tend to know like the Kickapoo more, but like that's also in Mexico too. Hi, Felefenefe. So, how are you? So we get influence from all of these different languages, and I'm doing great. I'm glad to be streaming today. Got done writing, because I'm writing another chapter for my book, and have all that done. So that's why if you go to the states of like Aguascalientes and further north, you will notice that there are more people who are, I don't know why Stream Elements is saying that. I don't even know how that even started, because I didn't even, because I have a thing that says like, oh, I'm working, if I want to do a co-working stream, but I decided to just finish that first. That way I could just like focus on stream instead of like, being quiet.
Of Mexico, but it had the most influence because of its presence in central Mexico and the colonial capital in Mexico City, previously known by its Nahuatl name Tenochtitlan. While indigenous languages continued to be spoken in Mexico, during the colonial period, Spanish became the prestige language, which increased its dominance and the decline of others. Today, 92.7% of the population speaks only Spanish. Features. Aside from having its own accent,
So when they say 97.2% of the people speak just Spanish, again, that means that there are, so the way in which a lot of the figures are counted in Mexico, and this is, so they decided in the 20th century that they were going to stop asking race, like what race are you, right, on the census in Mexico, right? They said there's no need to ask that question, right? We need to know how many people there are in general. We don't need to know like, oh, what category, because one, either you reinstitute the colonial system of las castas, where you're like, well, if your father is white and your mom is indigenous, then you're mestizo, but if your mom is mestizo and your dad is white, you're castizo, and like you don't want to. They didn't want to do any of that. Especially because at that time, that the separate, like those colonial era separations had kind of gone down into overarching ones, right? So like white meaning just European, right? Indigenous meaning, just indigenous culture, and then mestizo, which became this kind of like national identity, again, that was constructed. That's an important thing, is that during the 20th century, the separation of people from different races into seeing themselves as one whole, right? One entity, for the most part, was through the Secretariat of Public Education and through different educational programs that sought to see history in a progressive way, right? In the sense that the mestizaje was seen as a positive, right? As opposed to like lowering your status, it was seen as like the status itself of being Mexican. But anyway, now I'm digressing. But the point being that again, the more farther south you go, the higher chance you will meet people that speak indigenous languages. Now, why do I note speech? Because that's how Mexico counts how many indigenous people there are. I think that that's I don't want them to have to revive the race question, right? Like, no, I don't want that. But I think that, it's kind of like when you see numbers drop, it just means speakers of those languages. Again, it also somewhat refers to living in specific communities, but like if you live in the greater Mexico City area, like there are towns just outside of like the metropolis itself that are, majority Nahuatl speaking, right? And they're and so anyway, so the way how the Mexican government counts it is by speakers. It doesn't count them by asking what race they are, right? Because it doesn't want to make them seem as though somehow they're not Mexican, right? Because they're indigenous, right? Again, this is a lengthy discussion that I we'll talk about some other time. But anyway,
an intonation and its own slang, which has a reputation for being relatively insane. Mexican Spanish is mostly the same as European Spanish, though there are a number of differences that are worth mentioning. A lot of those differences are true for other varieties of Latin American Spanish as well.
I don't like the usage of that term, but insane, because it's not. It's like you have a country, right, that was had many large communities of peoples that didn't just go away, right? Like one thing in the United States, they like to act as though like indigenous people are somewhere in the past, right? They almost as anthropological subjects. Whereas in Mexico, it's difficult to do that because that's just not the reality, right? That's just not the reality of how the country is. Like in Argentina, it's easy for them to focus on La Gran Migración, right? That happened at the turn of the 20th century, where you get, millions of people arriving to Buenos Aires, for example. Was there a significant migration from indigenous communities to big cities in Mexico? Yes, there was. There was historically. There has always been that, right? Because of economic opportunity, etc. All that stuff. But once the state started to recognize the communities, I mean, this is still an issue, right? Like even to this day. I mean, I posted this on Twitter before I I was posting about how there was a march in Mexico City that started the day after I came back from, I was hanging out with my mom. And so they were protesting against la guerra contra los zapatistas, right? And so there is a group of people kind of sort of generally know what the zapatistas are. They're not anarchists. They said this many times before. They are not anarchists. But the point being that the autonomy of where they live is what they stress first, right? And they don't like that Mexico, because of this myth of mestizaje, kind of some people view indigeneity as something that will be progressed forward by mestizaje. So one of those things was, of course, just where indigenous communities tend to be more or less, right, far away from, say, the large economic centers of Guadalajara, La Ciudad de Mexico, Veracruz, etc. That's not completely true in the sense that it's not every indigenous community, but like the ones that are in the northern part of Mexico itself, that's where you tend to see a lot of migration into cities, because otherwise they only have, the land that they have. And right now Mexico is in a severe drought, so like a 20-something year drought, and it's just getting worse and worse and worse and worse. So you do have a lot of migration like that to big cities. The largest migration patterns tend to be to go to Mexico City, Guadalajara, and to the border towns. And that's general, right? More so Mexico City. Like when I was in Mexico City, you could meet people who, like for example, this actually, rather let me give an example of another place where this is also the case. In Bolivia, right, which is actually one of the two majority indigenous countries in the entire Americas, there were some people that wanted to file a complaint, a labor dispute, because they were being, overworked, etc., exploited in Brazil, right? Because Brazil is a huge economy, etc., blah, blah, blah. But when they went to the embassy, they only spoke Spanish. And those people did not speak Spanish because, again, all of the languages are recognized, but there was this disconnect between representing all of those all of those nations within the country. Because that's why it's called La República Plurinacional, right? Plurinational. Mexico tries to be kind of like the neutral party, in the sense that it will we'll have stuff in all these languages and stuff, but I wish that it would do even more to promote its constitutional requirements. Like the Constitution itself of 1917 that's still in force today requires the government to do more, but right now with the Tren Maya, which it's a weird thing, because it's like you want there to be high-speed trains, you want there to be infrastructure, but you don't want it to come at the cost of priceless archaeological sites, cultural sites, and also forest, right? Like you don't want forest to go away, especially right now that Mexico's in a huge drought. Like if anything, we need reforestation, but whole different story. So there's that. But yeah, typically people move in the interior of Mexico, Monterrey, La Ciudad de Mexico, and its huge metro area. It's like the second largest on the planet, and then Guadalajara would be the next one. One thing I also don't like too is that this map, I know it's saying Spanish and it's focusing on, but I actually wanted to show a video if people are interested, of people that live in the only officially recognized country in Africa that speaks Spanish, which is right here, this little square between Senegal and Gabon. It's called Equatorial Guinea, and it was the only sub-Saharan Spanish colony that ever existed up until 1968. The other one is just underneath Morocco, called Western Sahara, but it's in dispute, and so if you speak Spanish and you wanted to, say, visit Africa, and for example, you wanted to visit the part that is where it's more the parts where it's much more because if you go to South Africa, if you're on the West Cape, there are some very dry areas, right? Which is why there's a lot of wine growing in that area. But if you want to see more rainforest, stuff like that, if you really want to have that experience, Equatorial Guinea is a place you can go to, and again, they speak Spanish, so. But it's very rarely mentioned. Western Sahara is a whole different story. That's a whole topic for another day,
But we're going to focus mainly on Mexican Spanish. Like most varieties of Latin American Spanish, Mexican Spanish features ceseo. That means that the letter Z and the letter C before I or E are pronounced S rather than Th, as they are in the pronunciation that's considered standard in Spain.
So this the thetheo, right, where they do, it's not a lisp, it's not a mispronunciation. It's that the Castilian language, right, which is what we now call Spanish, but in Spanish often we'll call it Castellano, or is that the pronunciation of the ts, like next to each other, the t sound, right, of the z, right, like in paparazzi, right, for example, like in Italian, Castilian pronounces that as a th sound, as a th sound, and so that is their pronunciation of. So it's not a mispronunciation, it's just how they pronounce that sound. Like when they see, right, a Z, to them it's the th sound, right? Whereas in Italian it's the t sound, like pizza, right? Instead you would say pizza, right? Because again, you can see how they're very similar and related, the t and the th, because it's just a slight movement of the tongue. But again, it's like people often mistakenly say that like there's this story that was told. I know, like it's funny because I was never told this as a kid, but other people were told this as a kid, and I don't know if that's because like I grew up in a family that like already spoke multiple languages or whatever, but or what, I mean, I don't even know. I don't even know if that's even a good explanation for why. But there was this belief that like the king lisped, so everyone else lisped too to sound like him. But that isn't true. That isn't true. This is just the morphology of Castilian. So the th sound is the th sound in Castile. Whereas in other places in Spain, particularly Andalusia, they pronounce it as an S. But they like even in Spain itself, the further north you go, the more chance that you're going to have the th sound. But once you go into Andalusia, because of the influence of Arabic and other, Latin, etc., you have the pronunciation as an S instead.
For example, the word for shoe. In Spain, it sounds like this.
Zapato.
And in Mexico, it sounds like this.
Zapato.
The verb meaning to do or make. In Spain,
do Spanish people also pronounce the yes, yeah, Cádiz, Ibiza, Barcelona, but yeah, Cádiz. Because again, it's that sound, right? It's that sound that's different. Like, it's kind of like how, again, like I was saying, like in northern Mexican Spanish, people read ch, and to them, they are pronouncing it correctly, right? That's the thing about language, is like they are saying, when they look at that letter, right? When they look at that phrase, right? Like say Charles, right? To them, they're saying it correctly, right? And that's how language works, right? But to some people, they're like, oh, that's mispronunciation. But no, that's just a dialectical difference. So yeah, in Spain they say Cádiz, centímetro, all this, everything. Aranjuez, yeah, Aranjuez. That they say that. That's the name of the city. But
Hacer.
and in Mexico.
Hacer.
The reason for this is that many of the Spanish settlers in Mexico and in the New World in general were from Andalusia, where Ceseo was and still is a part of some people.
So I talked about this before, and I remember someone actually was like, I remember that there was this kind of I don't know if it was like a confusion or something, but los andaluces, right, or los andaluces, right, Andalusi, which is interesting because it's one of the few demonyms in Europe that function like a Semitic language, like in this case Arabic, right? Because you can say Andalusi, right, where that's not very common anywhere else. But anyway, in Europe that is. So why was it that this region in particular was because, one, this area already had a seafaring culture, right? It already had the port of Palos, which is where Christopher Columbus left from, Cadiz, which became a main port later on in the 18th century and 19th century, and they had Sevilla, which is inland on a river, but the river, its name is escaping me right now, but the river is wide enough to where ships can go up there, and that's where they have the La Casa de las Americas, which is like where they have all of the documents that talk about, oh, this person bought 300 acres of this, blah blah blah. Like they have all those types of things there. They have all of the lists of what came in Spanish galleons, etc., etc. So most of Mexico was populated by people who initially was by people from Andalusia. Another thing was when they divided the viceroyalty of New Spain into different kingdoms, like the kingdom of Nueva Vizcaya or or Nuevo Santander, or the main one is Nueva Galicia, right, which is now Jalisco, Zacatecas, that part of western central Mexico. A lot of people did move to the new version of where they were from, right? Like, oh, yo soy gallego, I'm from Galicia, so I'm gonna move to New Galicia, right? That El Archivo de Indias, yeah, and then they also have Casa de América, La Casa de las Américas. I think La Casa, El Archivo de las Indias, yes, that's what I was referring to. La Casa de las Américas is the one that has that one also has a lot of the documentation too, in part with that. In fact, I mentioned before that when a historian whose work is very important to my own went to Spain to look for provanzas, as they were called back then, she couldn't find ones because they had sort of put them all over in different institutions. One of them was in La Casa de América. One of them was in El Archivo General de las Indias. Part of it is also at this research library in Chicago, in the United States. Another part of it is in La Universidad de Buenos Aires. It's like all over the place. Cuba, for example, actually got a lot of immigration from Canarias, or the Canary Islands. In fact, Fidel Castro's parents were from Canarias. Like they had moved over from Canarias, which remember, at the time that this happened, Cuba and Puerto Rico were part of Spain. So, that's why this, it wasn't such a, but you can see, especially if you watch a lot of Cuban movies, because they actually have a really big film industry in Cuba, which is actually really good. There's one I'm thinking about, but they used to have different banks. El Banco Gallego, El Banco Andalusí, El Banco de Valenciano, etc. And like people would, when they moved to Havana, they would open up their little accounts, and everything was connected to Spain still, even before the revolution, right? There was still a colonial relationship to some degree, in the sense that the white people of Cuba still identified with Spain itself. So, and there were still lots of migration to Cuba as well, even after the war. Whereas, again, because all of the countries in the Americas are settler colonial states, all of them are, but only few of them are majority white, right? Like, so anyway, that's a whole different story.
Speech. So essentially, a dialectal feature from southern Spain became the norm in Mexico and throughout most of Latin America. Like most varieties of Spanish nowadays, Mexican Spanish exhibits yeísmo. This means that the Spanish phoneme represented by LL, y, has merged into the phoneme represented by the letter Y. So now, Y and double L represent the same sound. That phoneme is usually rendered as a voiced palatal fricative, y, which is similar to the English Y sound, y, but has a little more friction. So to me, it's sometimes...
So this is actually interesting because you can actually, this is actually dependent upon where people are from in Mexico. if, like, for example, there's a movie, right, where they say, te quiero decir que Yesenia, right? It's a Y, but they pronounce it like a J sound. Some people in some parts of Mexico do say that, right? Like yo voy ir, right? But I've noticed that in northern Mexico, it's always the Y sound, like a flat Y sound. So it's always yo voy a ir. Which that J sound is related to why if you go to Argentina and other areas in South America, you will hear it pronounced like a J, or typically now in Argentina, it's a sh sound, like yo quiero, stuff like that. So
That sounds like it's somewhere between y and j. Y. Let's compare these two words, focusing on the phoneme in the middle of each word.
Vaya, vaya.
The sound in the middle of each word is the same. It's y. But in Mexico, you will also hear that phoneme pronounced as an affricate, j, especially after a pause. Grammar. One obvious difference between European Spanish and Mexican Spanish, along with other Latin American varieties, is a difference in the second-person plural pronouns. In Spain, there's a second-person plural informal pronoun,
Vosotros.
which is used to address friends, family, children, and
yeah, I've read that it's more porteño because of the fact that like Italian immigrate, like because of the, like if you go to the areas like the more criollo areas, right, like in the interior, you will have the j sound more. But if you're in Buenos Aires, like el acento porteño is the y, the sh all the time, sh. Same thing in Montevideo. Like if you go to Montevideo, there they say sh, but if you go like out towards donde nació Carlos Gardel, I don't remember where that is in Uruguay, but anyway, or where they say he was born anyway. You will hear more the j sound. But like if you go to the northernmost part of America that speaks Spanish, they say it as y, like as softly as possible. Whereas if you go down to the to Argentina, etc., you will hear it more pronounced, the j or the sh sound. But yeah, it's definitely much more a porteño thing, and that's because of the influences of French, Italian, all the different Russian, etc.
and animals, and there's a second-person plural formal pronoun,
Ustedes.
which is used to address other people. In Mexican Spanish, vosotros is not used. In both formal and informal situations,
Well, it's not used unless you're talking about the Bible. In the Bible, they will say vosotros sois, right? They will say that. But if you are not like very religious, or you were never really brought up in a Catholic home, right? Like for example, even in translations of Jewish texts into that are into Spanish, a lot of times they just keep it like as the modern way of speaking, right? The way how they speak it in Mexico, right? Where they say ustedes, blah blah blah. But in the Bible, because of that history of it having, like even the Protestant version of the Bible, which is called La Reina Valera edition, because there were Protestants that founded their own churches in Spain, even though Spain was like the bulwark of Catholicism, it seems. But even in those, they say like when you're speaking to like when Jesus is speaking to people, right? They say he will say like, oh, vosotros sois las personas, blah blah blah. But in like that's the only time it's really used, or in historical documents as well. Like stuff I have to read, oftentimes they will even say vos, which is not common at all in Mexico. Like tuteo, even in parts of Mexico that have historically used voseo, have lost it over time just because of like one, the education program of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s in Mexico, and two, the sort of like cultural recalibration, I guess is one way to put it, where now the center of culture and education and everything kind of went back into the interior of Mexico, where before trans-border communities, like in Guatemala and Belize, were more connected than than now. So anyway.
The pronoun is
Ustedes.
It's worth pointing out that vosotros doesn't just replace usted.
Oh, also, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's watching the stream. I hope that you're enjoying it. If you would like to help grow the stream, you can always, make sure to subscribe so you don't have to see the ads that happen every half hour, But also, consider helping me directly. Again, as a researcher, I have here a list of other places that you could go as well. If you would like to help me more directly, or on Throne, where you could help me. For example, right now we have a 33% funded book. If you would like to help add to that, I would really appreciate it. Again, just a quick reminder. Anyway.
It also has its own conjugations. If you're learning Mexican Spanish, you can get away with not learning those. Well, at least until you visit Spain. For the second person singular in both countries, there's an informal pronoun,
Tú.
and a formal pronoun,
Usted.
In some parts of southern Mexico, near the borders.
Yeah, so this is what I was just talking about. If you go to the areas, the areas that, cause see, it's listed here as voceo in speech. Like they will say, oh, vos querés esta cosa, right? Or whatever it might be. But it's, again, like it's diminished over time, especially because of the economic development that's occurred, right? Like especially with the tourism industry in Cancun and other places, it's kind of forced people to kind of lose that voceo in speech because other people, like it's because people go there from the United States that are Mexican, but also Americans too, and people from the rest of Mexico don't use it. So you're seeing less and less of it, which is unfortunate, I think, because I actually like the fact that there was this difference that existed within the country. But I do know that in a lot of places, like Venezuela, Colombia, like again, it's like it just depends. Like one is usually seen as more formal than the other, and then it's given prestige over the other one. So, and that typically tends to be, at least in Mexico, tuteo, right? Saying tú eres,
With Guatemala and Belize, vos is used instead of tú, or...
In here we use it quite a lot, but just in informal context. What do you mean, the vos in informal context, or? Because like you... Oh. Yeah, like again, like I've seen people that kind of go back and forth between them, but the places that I see them most used is of course in Argentina, just because Argentina, culturally speaking, and Mexico are kind of like the two, and Spain are like the three cultural poles, I guess one could think of them like that. I don't like to think of things in that way though, but like the publishing industry, the movie industry, right? Like the film industry, the television industry, all that stuff. All those things tend to be concentrated in Mexico or the United States, right? Spain, or in the Southern Cone, typically Argentina. Oh, yeah, sure. Let's see here. Let me see here. Huh. Weird. Okay, just give me one quick second. Okay, there we go. And hi, it's so good to see you, Redacted. But to insult, okay, I see that. But like I said, like in Mexico, like it's just never really used, and even like the new Bibles are kind of getting rid of the voceo too, because yes. So anyway.
In addition to it, this is called voceo. The varieties of Spanish spoken in these areas have more in common with Central American Spanish. They are influenced by the Mayan languages that have historically been spoken in the area and are still spoken there today. Expressing the past. There's a difference in how the preterite and present perfect tenses are used in Spain and in Mexico. In Mexico, the distinction is similar to in English, with the present perfect used for actions in the past up until the general present, and with the preterite, the simple past tense, used to talk about actions completed in the past at known or specified times. In Spain, on the other hand, the present perfect is usually used for all recently completed actions. For example, take this sentence meaning, I spoke to my mother this morning. In Spain, it's
He hablado con mi madre esta mañana.
and in Mexico, it's
Hablé con mi madre esta mañana.
Notice that in Spain, the present perfect is used, even though this action took place at a specified time in the past. While in Mexican Spanish, that would result in one using the preterite tense, or the simple past.
So I don't want, again, because he does go into like the grammar of everything, it does sort of go into that as well. Like, for example, I've noticed that that a lot of times in Spanish spoken in Central America, South America, they will say si fuese verdad, right? Whereas in Mexico, you can say si fuera verdad. Like, it's like this very different way of, again, it's just very slight grammatical things that are considered, like, at least in speech, are considered okay, right? But yeah. So anyway, so again, and also FLFNF, like, do you notice that too? Like, is it more si fuese, or can you use como si fuera esto, right? You can say that a lot, and like and things like that, como si hubiera ido, like if I would have gone. I don't know. If I just noticed that like there's a lot of little differences that sometimes you can say, like in reference to the past. We use como si fuera. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Preterite form, or the simple past, is actually used more in Mexico than in any other Spanish-speaking country. In European Spanish, to include...
I am not surprised that Mexico, like, there actually is a really good quote. Let me see here if I can find it. This is actually by, this is by Octavio Paz, who's like, I believe he's the only Mexican that's received the Nobel Prize in Literature, which, come on, Nobel Committee, like, come on. Like, Mexico is actually known for very important writers, but they never wanted to give it to, I don't know. They tend, como si fuese, me suena como forma. Yeah. I get that too, yeah. Where is it? Here we go. Una sociedad se define no solo por su actitud ante el futuro, sino frente al pasado. Sus recuerdos no son menos reveladores que sus proyectos. Aunque los mexicanos estamos preocupados mejor dicho, obsesionados con nuestro pasado, no tenemos, well, I'll just leave it there. So it says, a society defines itself not only by its attitude or its way of thinking about the future, but also in confronting the past, right? Its memories are not any less revelatory than its projections into the future, right? Like they don't, like looking at the past doesn't tell you less than what people expect the future to be, if that makes sense. Like the future, yeah. And he says, even though Mexicans are preoccupied with our history, then he says, better said, we are obsessed with our history. And that is something that is very true, that I would say about Mexico, that like the amount of history that there is in Mexico, and I think this has to do a lot with many reasons. I'm not going to say it's unique to Mexico, but I do think Octavio Paz is right in that there is this constant sort of anxiety about the past in Mexican literature and Mexican culture and right? Like that's why in a weird way because like also like the whole like indigenous groups that like, you know, they didn't have a negative view of death. It's like the future is not as like, oh, there's an end, right? Like it's not like in most Western countries, right? Because it's like instead we're preoccupied with the past. We're like, oh, what has already happened, right? Not what we know, like, because we're like, death, oh yeah, that's whatever, like death is fun, you know? It's like, okay, maybe not that, I shouldn't have said it like that, but you know what I mean, like the relationship that the Mexica and other peoples had towards death is very different from, like, say, it's more like akin to that of in Hindu culture in northern India, right? Where it's like it's seen as a celebration as opposed to like this horrible tragedy. So anyway, I don't know why I said it like that, but anyway, point being that this obsession with the past is something that has shown itself even in the first historical novel ever written in Mexico, which was written in 1848. So just as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is signed and Mexico is now being defined for the future, that is when the first novel that's obsessed with the past is written. And it is written in a way that actually is in an older form of writing novels that was already coming to an end in France. And that is the kind of novels that they would publish in like newspapers and journals and stuff. By the time that this novel starts being written, La hija del judío is what it's titled, by Justo Sierra O'Reilly from an Irish immigrant family, which a lot of Irish people moved to Mexico because, you know, Catholicism. But anyway, point being that it's right at this time that, like, you know, Mexico's history gets determined in some way, or part of Mexico's future is kind of like forced to be in a certain way, that immediately there's this turn to the past. And it's using a method that in France, because they started to do kind of like in the United States, they had like the Stamp Act, right? Like they're like, oh, if you want to buy a newspaper or something, right, you had to buy a stamp also. France did the same thing, essentially, on its newspapers, and it completely ruined the whole, like, novels being written in journals and newspapers, because nobody wanted to pay for the paper and el timbre, right, and the stamp. So in France, that's why it fizzled out, and you don't really get any, like, novels like that it still existed in Latin America, for example. Like, this tradition in Latin America kept on going, right? And Mexico is one example of this being the case. So anyway.
Inquire about degree, like how big, for instance. People ask,
¿Cómo de
in Mexican Spanish, it's,
qué tan?
for example,
¿Qué tan grande es el terreno?
this means how big is the piece of land. In Spain, it would be,
¿Cómo de grande es el terreno?
and this distinction applies to Latin American Spanish in general, not only Mexican Spanish. The negation word no is sometimes left out and understood from context in sentences with hasta, which means until. This sentence means we won't get paid until next month in Spain
No recibiremos el pago hasta el próximo mes.
and in Mexico.
Recibiremos el pago hasta el próximo mes.
Notice that
Well, yeah, again, like another thing too is just, again, like one is another thing too is that to add to this is there is that where you do drop the no when it comes to hasta, because it means like until, like not until this point, because like saying until, it does mean until, but it means like not until this point, as well, like at least in this context, right? Recibiremos el pago hasta el próximo mes, like, you know, technically you can say that, and that makes sense, but it's because the hasta means it's not happening until, like, up until this, the time that we're talking about. So that's another thing. What is the QR code? Oh, the QR code is for
the word no
is for throne. Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Big Room. Yes, have a great week to you too. Thank you so much. So the QR code is just thrown because I have I have books that I use for my research. I mentioned earlier that I started writing another chapter of a book that I'm writing, and so I often need books because I like write in them. And because I'm a historian, I tend to use the same books over and over and over too. So so that's why I like books that I really need, that I'm gonna use, like, for that I really need, are there on Throne if people want to help me out in some way when it comes to my research. But that's what that QR code is. Anyway.
is not present in this sentence, but it's understood from context. This makes sense to me if I think of it in a slightly different way. Time will pass until next month, then we will get paid. Note that in Mexican Spanish, both ways are valid, with no or without no. Another thing to add is that in European Spanish, it would probably be more natural to say it this way.
No recibiremos el pago hasta el mes que viene.
Notice how next month is expressed. This could also be used in Mexico, but the way we heard it before is more common there. In Mexican Spanish, bien is sometimes used with the meaning of very. This sentence means, this computer is very expensive.
Esta computadora está bien cara.
This is different from the way the word is used in other Spanish varieties. Usually it's used to modify a verb with the meaning of well. In Spain, you'll likely hear this,
Este ordenador es muy caro.
with muy instead of bien.
That's true. Like, oh, está bien grande, but it's because, like, I'm trying to find like an English example, because English does this too, where it will use like other words except besides very, very, right? Like very, very big, right? Instead it will say like, other things, like très and trop in French. But I do know that, like, in Mexican, so yeah, el carro está bien grande, la casa está bien chiquita, and it's meant more as an emphasis, right? That's what it's supposed to be used for, is that it's to emphasize the fact that it's small, like it is well small, right? Like, I know that in English sometimes even using the well, like it's well nigh the hour before blah blah blah, right? But still, I think that's, yeah, like greatly, yeah, exactly.
Also notice that the sentence in Mexican Spanish uses the verb estar, while the sentence in European Spanish uses ser. In Mexican Spanish, ser would be used to say that computers in general are expensive, but for a specific computer, estar is used. In European Spanish, ser is used because it describes the general state of the computer. If you used estar, it would imply that the price is currently expensive. In other words, the price has changed or is variable, but that would require more context. Vocabulary. Mexican Spanish has some vocabulary that differs from European Spanish. The truth is that all Spanish-speaking countries have some of their own vocabulary. In Spain, the word meaning here is,
Aquí,
and in Mexico it's,
acá,
in Spain, the word for
Well,
car
hold
is,
up, hold up, hold up. Well, technically, you can say aquí and acá. Like aquí means like here, y acá means like here but not here, if that makes sense. Like, ven para acá, like come here, but it's like it's referencing the fact that there's like some distance from the thing, right? Because it's not like we don't use aquí estamos. Oh my gosh, thank you so much, DJ Chai, so much for your raid. Thank you. So glad that you are here. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. So yeah, like, vente pa acá, like, come here. Like, yeah, it does mean that, but it's more like, almost like a present progressive, like, move, come hither, right? Like, that's more what it means. Like, it's referencing the fact that you're not close by, as opposed to aquí, which just reference, like, it's kind of like in Hebrew, like po. Hi. Oh, I like your emotes. It's like in Hebrew, you can say po, like ani po, I am here, right? And that's when, like, when say you were to take attendance, right? Like when I was in yeshiva, you would say po, like here, but you wouldn't say necessarily le po, like to here, right? It's, thank you so much for giving the shout out. Yes. Thank you so much, DJ. I really appreciate it. And so, yeah, that's, I don't know, like, I do realize that there is a difference between aquí y acá, but even in my own head, I'm trying to think, like, aquí means one thing, acá means something slightly different. Yes, welcome in, welcome in.
coche,
in Mexico it's sometimes,
coche,
but it's sometimes,
carro,
this seems to depend on the region.
Again, yeah, it's regional, right? It's the same thing, for example. If I can compare it to another Romance language that's spoken on the border with the US, that's to say Quebec, Québécois French, right? Is that en le français québécois, on dit char, right? One says char for car. They do not say voiture as they would say in France, right? Une voiture vient, right? Is a car is coming, right? That is how you would say it in French. But in Québécois French, you can say un char vient. And the reason why is because, again, it's taken from a different, just a different vocabulary and a relationship to that. Because, like, for example, coche can also mean carriage, right? Whereas carro means, you know, it means also like in trains, right? Like the cars, right? Train cars. It also means that you wouldn't say coches, you would say los carros. But that's more, I've noticed that's more of a northern thing. And that's because, you know, because car, carro, right? But if you go to Mexico City, it's always coche. Like if you go to like where most people live in Mexico, which is like the central band of colonial cities, I mean, the more west and north you go, the more interchangeable, but people know what you're talking about. Like, it's not like people be like, I have no idea que es un carro. Like, you know, it's not that distinct.
Similarly, the common expressions for to drive a car are normally different. In Spain, you say,
conducir un coche,
but in Mexico, you might hear,
manejar un carro.
So, yes, technically speaking, you actually in Mexico, you can use both. Because you like, oh, voy a tomar mi examen para, you know, conducir, right? It's like your test to drive, your driving test, right? Or voy a ir a las clases de conductor, or like whatever, right? But manejar, which it has a similar, like, because the thing is that both of them mean to make happen. Like that's kind of a weird way of putting it in English, but it's like drive, right? Like when you drive something, it's expressing that you're causing it to do something, right? So conducir, like think of it like a conductor, right, of an orchestra, or like a semiconductor in a microchip, right? They facilitate in action, right? So that's the difference when you say conducir is formal, right? But manejar is it's more common, but it's also more informal too. Because like another thing too that you'll see in northern Mexico is that they will say camión when they mean a bus. Kind of like how in England they say coach to mean like buses, like those type of buses, like so in a similar way in northern Mexico they say that. Whereas if you go if generally in Spanish camión means like an 18-wheeler, right? Like that's what a camión is. But in northern Mexico you will see like la central camionera, and it will be buses, right? So yeah, there's that too.
Or
Manejar un coche.
in Spain, the word for glasses is,
Gafas.
and in Mexico it's,
Lentes.
in Spain, the word for pen is,
Bolígrafo.
and in Mexico it's,
Luma.
So one thing is that again, this is a reference to what glasses are, right? Like, because if you think of it in English, how you say glasses, right? You're literally referring to this, to the glass itself, right? These are glasses. There is a way to say like before spectacles, right? But it doesn't really make sense in a more modern context. In Mexico, you can find things that say bolígrafo. Like in fact, when I was just in Mexico City, and I had to buy a pen. It said bolígrafo, but still you say la pluma, and that is again a reference to, it is like the reference to like an older form of writing, but it's just like there's no need to change that word like la pluma. Now, I'll just leave it at that.
and the word for juice, in Spain it's,
Zumo.
and in Mexico it's,
Jugo.
the word for potato, in Spain it's,
Patata.
and in Mexico it's,
Papa.
this word, papa, is used in most Spanish-speaking countries and comes from the Quechua language.
Yeah, so the reason why the Spanish say patata is because most of the remember at this time Spain's empire also spanned Europe as well. And so when it was tomatoes, potato, etc., like a lot of the stuff that was sold was often sold not in Spain itself, but often in their other European colonies, or whatever if you want to, realms. One of them was the Kingdom of Naples, and this is what some linguistic historians have said, is that either it's because the merchants themselves that came to buy in the New World then called them this, or that over time Spain adopted patata, because if you say it in Italian, like for example, I speak Italian. I speak actually with a Roman accent, a Roman dialect, so it's known for being different from the Florentine and from the Neapolitan, which is the Neapolitan is known for being very quick. The Roman one is known for elongating, being very sing-songy. That's the Roman one, right? So you could say insalata di patate, right? And that is the plural patate for patata, right? Which is, and so it is believed then that because it was introduced by Italian merchants first, and they call it patata and patate, that's why Spain also, because in French they say patate, right? So they also say pomme d'or, right? Which, pardon me, pomme de terre, but that doesn't quite work in Spanish. manzana del suelo, like it doesn't work, or manzana de la tierra, like it doesn't work. And pomodoro, which is the Italian word for tomato, means like the golden apple. So it's like, I don't know. I've always found linguistic history to be very fascinating.
Language. How did it enter Mexican Spanish from Quechua? Quechua is not spoken in Mexico. Well, potatoes originated in Peru, where Quechua is the most...
Oh, I wish Sarah Wants a Cookie was in here, because like this, like, I don't know why, one, because she's from Peru, but two, also because she was talking to me about something about potatoes the other day. So, yeah, I don't know. ¿Qué tan extendido geográficamente era el cultivo de la papa en América precolombina? Era solamente en estas áreas aquí, donde primariamente en Perú y también en Ecuador. Era primariamente donde estaban produciendo las papas. Pero también puedes encontrar en Bolivia, pero es más a este lado, es decir, al norte-oeste del lago Titicaca. Como si vas más para este lado, ahí es donde está el cultivo más activo de papas en las Américas precolombinas. Y es porque es hacer con la tierra, ¿verdad? Como es algo que está del interior de Perú, ¿verdad? Está en las montañas, no está en el plano litoral, ¿verdad? No está en ese... Pero sí estaba hasta como en Colombia también. Y es de allí donde empezaron a también a mover, es decir, es allí también donde empezaron a cultivar y luego vender a España.
most widely spoken indigenous language. In Spain, the word for computer
And
is...
also, as I was just saying to FLFNF, is that also another thing too is there are so many varieties of potatoes too, that like some of which we just I've never tried. It's the same way how like Mexico, because it's where they domesticated maíz, right? Maize, corn. There are types of corn that, in fact, this is actually why Mexico is actually kind of trying to like not buy American corn anymore, because Americans know white corn, of course, and like yellow corn, but they're also like much more sweeter. Sometimes you might have seen like blue tortillas, right? Again, those come from, but there are also some that are red. There are some that are purple. There are some that are even black, and they have different flavor profiles, but they also are used for different like dishes, right? Like for example, like you use masa when you're like, well, my grandmother, the way how she made it, and I don't know if this is anyway, like if you go to northern Mexico, they don't call this atole, but the atole was more like the original atole of the indigenous peoples, in that it had masa, corn dough, right, like bits of it, that was they have like this thing, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's like a frother kind of, and you mix it up, and it's like, so when you're drinking it is kind of grainy, but that's the point, right? It's supposed to have that grainy nature because it's made with maize.
Ordenador.
which is borrowed from the French word
Ordinateur.
In Mexico, it's...
Computadora.
This word comes from computar, to compute, plus the agent suffix dora, based on the English word computer. That word is used in various Spanish-speaking countries. There are, however, more English words in Mexican Spanish than in any other variety of Spanish, particularly in northern Mexico, because of proximity to the United States. Here are a few examples. The word for hobby or pastime. In Spain it would be
Pasatiempo.
but in Mexico you'll likely hear
Hobby.
the word...
Is it? I'm sorry, but I ain't never heard nobody say el hobby. I'm sorry. I don't know why that just sounds so funny to me, but just like el hobby. Okay. I've heard pasatiempo. Like maybe in America, I've seen people say like, "Oh, mis hobbies son blah blah blah," but el hobby, I've never heard that in Mexico ever. In fact, oh, they have these weird. They're like, some of them are like crosswords, and they call them matatiempos, and I've never really liked that because it's kind of like a weird, like, literally time killer. But yeah, right. It's like a hobby. Like I don't know. It's just like I've never heard anybody say that. But I don't know. Maybe in the United States, some people say el hobby, but it's just I never heard it.
Word for truck. In Spain, it's,
Camión.
but in Mexico, you might hear
Troca.
the word for watch.
Okay. Yes, you will hear la troca, right? You will hear, and if you're in LA, you will definitely hear el pico. You know, you will hear. But oh gosh, what's the word? Oh gosh, what's the other word? Now I'm forgetting it. Oh my gosh, there's another word that we use. Yeah, it's a northern thing. Because of America, because it's la troca, like the truck. Camioneta. That's another thing that we say in Mexico. Like a pickup truck is una camioneta, like a small camión, right? Or a small truck. So if you go down into more mainland Mexico, you will hear camioneta, or not troca. Like that's like if you live in Tijuana, like where I'm from, people say troca. I've never heard anybody say el hobby, but that's just me. I don't know. But anyway, you will hear la troca. That is true, but it's not as. Once you go into like where most people in Mexico live, like inland Mexico, you tend to hear camión, camioneta. The only exception is sometimes camión can also mean bus, like a big bus, not like a like the chartered buses, right? Which Mexico is actually kind of like its transit system, right? It's to get around the country. It's mostly done via bus, and it's very inexpensive. Like I can tell you that, like you can get on, and they're nice. Like it's not like, oh, you're in this horrible bus and it's like it's air conditioned. You have lots of room. You can watch TV. It has Wi-Fi, whatever. And you can take them all over the country. That's very common. They used to have trains. In fact, my mom remembers when she went on the steam engine ones back in the day. So, like back in the day, and then they had la bala, which means the bullet, but it was like the fastest train at its time, that connected Guadalajara all the way up to Mexicali. Anyway, I'm not gonna go into that whole stuff. Fuck America, by the way. Yes. Trains got... Yeah. Yep, exactly. Yeah. Like, Mexico is like... I love how people are like, well, Mexico had elections, but they could only vote for one person. Like, I love how they're like, it wasn't a dictatorship because people went to go vote. It's like, what? like Mexico's, dictatorship is very interesting because it's like it lasted for so long, and also it's like it's already known that there was a group of a junta, I guess, military junta in some ways, but also capitalists, right? That they were the ones who were like, we want this dude to be president, or we want that dude to be president, because it's always dudes, right? Up until this point anyway. And if you became el secretario de gobernación, which is the secretary of state in Mexico, you're back then you were gonna be the next that's how they set it up, right? But in America, they're I remember being taught this in America, Mexico's a democracy, it's just a one-party democracy, and I'm like, what? Willing to defend a dictatorship just because they changed the face of it, the person sitting in the fancy chair every 6 years. And I'm imagine if they would have given that license to the Soviet Union, right, or Cuba or whatever, right? It's they would never do that, right? But they made an exception for the dictatorship that they had control over, right? So yeah. I hate that they got rid of so many trains and they privatized all this shit. That's why right now the president of Mexico right now is trying to nationalize a lot of those railroads, because legit, like, the people that own them literally just like let them rot, right? And he's like, well, maybe we should build high-speed rail. And like the Supreme Court is like, you want to actually change, stuff in Mexico? Let's think about the effect that this would have with our trade with America, right? It's like, no. Like, she can't sit with us, okay? America cannot sit with us, because we don't care. We need trains. We need... Like, I hate how so much of what Mexico is building always has to be in the thought process of, like, how can Americans use it to get products from us? Like, no, that's not what you should be doing. Anyway, I know that in Latin America this is very common. This is a very common thing. But in Mexico, it is like, everything is like, oh, we're building a highway that connects to the American border. Why can't you just build a highway? Like, like we need a highway that goes east to west. Oh no, but then it won't go to the U.S. border, right? Anyway, I'll be right back. I'll be right back in one quick second. Hello, hello, hello. Okay, we're back. Yeah, well, not just the U.S. backed ones, Russian backed ones. You know, all imperialism is bad. So, I'm just saying, like, having lived in a country during a war that was anyway. I'm not gonna go into it, but
In Spain, it's
Ver.
in Mexico, it's sometimes,
Guachar.
and that word is also used in
okay, huachar. Yes, that is true. That is true. You will hear people say that. Huachar, como huacha, like guáchame ahorita que voy a ir a blah blah blah. Like that is true. Technically, that is true. But again, it's specifically in the context of that's in the context of like again watching, like especially again, like this is something I've heard more on the U.S. side of the border than on the Mexican side of on the other side, unless you're like right on the border. But
some contexts where the standard word would be
Mirar.
to look, and the word for mouse, as in a computer mouse, in Spain
Ratón.
and in Mexico.
Mouse.
Some words were borrowed from Nahuatl, which gives Mexican Spanish some of its unique flavor.
do they call it rat? Anyway, I'm not even gonna.
Words from Nahuatl are mainly nouns representing everyday things, like animals, plants, fruits and vegetables, foods and drinks.
But also, and something we did get from Nahuatl is our usage of ito, like our usage of diminutives, like vamos a ir a mi casita a tomarnos un cafecito. Like that's a very that comes from the Nahuatl and indigenous language heritage of it surrounds Spanish in Mexico. Like that is supposed to show intimacy, right? Like that's supposed to show closeness, warmth, etc. Whereas vamos a ir a mi casa a tomar un café almost sounds kind of like really formal, like oh, you know. But even like scholars, whatever, like they will say, oh, vamos a ir a mi casita, right? It's supposed to emphasize this kind of like not intimacy in like that way, but like intimacy between subjects, right?
And household goods. The word for grasshopper in Spain,
Saltamontes.
but in Mexico it's
Chapulín.
the word for turkey.
Also, yeah. Oh, you do the same thing there? Yeah, exactly. So, which I've heard that the one that's in the southern cone, that comes from the Italian, stuff too. Like also in the in the obverse sense, so to speak, like La Serenissima, right? From stuff like that is apparently more common in the southern cone. Espérame un poquito, yeah. One thing I did find that I did notice that there was a difference, which I don't know if this is like fully the case or if it's just kind of like how Spanish developed in Mexico, but like no más, right? Like as one word, no más, como no más voy a ir a la tienda. I am only gonna go to the store. As a word, I noticed some people were like, I don't know, like I've never seen that. Or ahorita. Ahorita vamos a ir a la tienda, right? Right, we're gonna go to the store right now, ahorita. Or ahorita mismo means like right now, this second. But chapulín, so I took pictures the other day and I think I uploaded them on Twitter, but recently I deactivated my Twitter just for a little while just because it's kind of like there's a lot of stuff going on Twitter and it's like really bad. Like Twitter's just horrible anyway. So I'm just like, if I might go back to it later, but right now it's kind of in this like weird, like I don't know what's going on with, like literally like whatever Elon's doing, whatever everybody else is doing. So I hate Italian, stupid pasta language. Well, I mean, like again, like well, see, I can even give you an example of where like the Roman Italian that I speak, we say a word that's different from the because like the official, right, official Italian, right, so to speak, right, the language that you're taught in school that you're supposed to write in is based off the Florentine dialect, right? That's why it will use terms that, because different parts of Italy also speak different languages, right, sub-languages in many cases too. So like for example, in Venice, you'll see the word calle, or it's like the Spanish word calle, right? When if you're going around the on around Venice, you'll see calle del calle de Santa Maria, right? You'll see that, but it's like just it means the same word as calle in Spanish, which means a street, right? Whereas in Rome, you always, or rather in Italy generally, you always say la via, right? The street. But in Roman Italian, they will say things that come more directly from Latin, because literally Rome is in the area called Lazio, which is historically also called Latium, right? Which is where the Latins are from, right? And so in Florence, they will say formaggio, right? Formaggio, voglio il formaggio nuovo. Ma è difficile decidere esattamente quale formaggio voglio, right? But in Rome, we say cacio, which there's also a famous dish that's pretty simple. My mom makes it all the time, cacio e pepe, right? Which means cheese and pepper, because that's all you really make it with. And it means cacio comes from the Latin caseum, which is where Spanish gets the word queso and German gets the word Käse, right? Like it comes from caseum in Latin. But if you go to France or in Florence, they say formaggio, fromage, etc. Chapulín in this case, where I went to in Mexico City, is called Chapultepec. So chapul, meaning chapulín, meaning grasshopper, tepec, meaning like mountain, hill, means like the mountain of the grasshopper. So it's known for, it's like when you get off on the stop for Chapultepec Park, which is huge. It's like 9 times the size of, I think it's 9 times. I could be wrong. Maybe it's 5 times. I forget exactly, but it's larger than Central Park in New York. Right? It's like a huge forest. You can actually, like one of the stations, it's like Chapultepec, Parque de Chapultepec or something like that. I forget which, because there's like 3 stations that stop right by it on the metro. One of them has a grasshopper. Like every single metro stop, they've made it so that there is a design for each stop. So there are other ways to reference where you want to go, right? So there's like a visual reference besides just saying, oh, like Fleet Street or whatever, right?
In Spain,
Pavo.
Anarco, the Spanish language is too much idioms than English language. I mean, I think that, I think it depends what you mean, because English does have a lot of idioms too. It's just that, like American English is very good at flattening idioms. Like it's very good at that. Like the standard American English that is taught is very good at getting rid of idioms. That, like, because I will say that, like, sometimes it is difficult for people that I know in Mexico to read a novel that's set in Colombia, right? That's written by a Colombian author, because they will have idiomatic differences that stick out. But that has to do with, again, its historical embeddedness of the language, right? So.
And in Mexico,
Guajolote.
in Nahuatl, many of these words have the absolutive suffix TL, which developed into the TE ending in Mexican Spanish.
By the way, guajolotas, which, yes, guajolote is a turkey, because they make mole de guajolote, which is, if you've ever had like mole poblano, it's good, but the one that they use, guajolote, is sweeter, because they use like, what are those things called? They're famous in Turkey. They're like orange-ish. They're usually dried. Oh gosh, I can't. They're not plums. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But the point is that they use fruit in the making of the mole sauce. It still has chile. It's still spicy, but it has a different flavor. And yes, the tl became te because because in Nahuatl that TL sound is like a specific phoneme. The right. Conocía la palabra chapulín por el chapulín colorado, pero no sabía qué significaba. Sí, yeah. Like there's a famous figure in Mexico called el Chapulín Colorado, which was from an actor who recently passed away. Well, actually passed away a while ago, but he was the red cricket, like that, or the grasshopper, right? And that's because Chapulín comes from chapul, which means, but a guajolota, if you go to Mexico City, this is only a Mexico City thing. If you go to Mexico City and you order and you get a guajolota, those are delicious. It is literally so in Mexico we also don't use we also have an extra term to mean sandwich, which is torta, right? You can get a torta, right, that's called una guajolota, which is a tamale torta. It is so good. I'm telling you. Like, I'm not even joking that like I had a friend who planned a trip to go to Mexico City. And the main thing they wanted to do was go where we went last time I was in Mexico City. Not this last time that I went, but the time before that. To go eat a guajolota at this place in Polanco. So it's like they're like really good. Like that's all I'm gonna say. Like if you like really spicy, get the green de pollo. But all of them are good. But the ones de pollo, like those are really good. Warm. They're served warm, fresh bread. Like, oh, it's so good. Anyway, I'm getting hungry now.
Words from the above categories with a TE suffix in Mexican Spanish are probably of Nahuatl origin. The word for owl.
Búho. Tecolote.
The word for vulture.
So, in also formality as well. Like, in academic language, you're supposed to use búho, but a lot of people are like, I don't know what that is. In America, I should say, because they're so used to the word tecolote, because tecolot means the owl, right? The owl. And there's actually a lot of myths, just as in Europe and in the rest of the world with owls as well. In fact, I remember learning, because I was raised on Jewish stories and indigenous stories too. So it was like this interesting mix of like, oh, there's the story about el tecolote and el árbol, that there's a dwarf. It's like there's like a witch, and he needs to, like, the owl, if it hurts him, so he has to put a stone in his hair, and I don't know. It's just like a really weird, it's like a really weird story. I don't know. Like, I can't remember exactly the details, but it's good.
Buitre.
Sopilote.
Yeah. So, sopilote. I almost want to watch an India Maria movie, but the problem with watching those movies is that, well, what she wanted to do, Maria Velasco, was to portray the kind of stock figure and the kind of, I don't want to say minstrel, but kind of like that, akin to that, definitely, to showcase the racism and the government, everything that discriminated against indigenous people, right? So, but I'm not trying to defend the whole thing. I'm just saying that was the purpose of her taking on the role of La India Maria, the indigenous, an indigenous woman in particular. Oh my gosh! Thank you so much, Iron Orchid. Thank you so much for the bits. I appreciate it. Yay! I'm glad. I'm glad that people are enjoying it. Yeah, I'm always like, oh my gosh, I'm like, what if I just like, go off into just pure history lectures? But yeah, so like, there's a really good movie that showcases she uses those tropes and that figure, right, to showcase the fact that the systemic discrimination against indigenous people is such that it involves literally the theft of lands. This is something that used to be said in Mexico, like if you have the deed to your land, you will hold that until your death, right? Because there are people that will make, back in the day they would make fake documents or whatever, or like, oh well, I'm just gonna purchase this whole, and they would dispossess people, especially indigenous people. So again, she uses this stock figure that is in some way minstrel-like, definitely going that direction, but it's not to direct, but of course, the intent of what she does, or what she did, I should say, in the films, does not necessarily mean that its legacy reflects that, right? Because some people have said that, like, oh, those movies are very racist, right? Because of their portrayal. But that is the purpose of them, too. So that's why it's kind of like, but the reason why I say this is because in those movies, you really see the usage of Nahuatl words, like you do, like when you're in Mexico, right? I've never had to say saltamontes. I've always said chapulín. I've always said guajolote, tecolote, sopilote, right? Like, now I have learned to say buitre because there's like something like in Argentina, and people live in the, like, they know when like buitre also means something else in reference to IMF loans, right? Búho, right? Like when because you have to know like the technical terms, right? But like there are people that put tecolotes on their house to keep away, like, they're fake, not real, like these owl statues, so that way other birds won't get on their roof and stuff in LA. Very common.
The word for kite.
In fact, if I could show my neighbor's house, but I don't want to, but if I did, like, they literally have two and one of them spins around in the wind. I don't know why it makes me laugh. It's always made me laugh, like, since, like, oh my gosh, like, just because it's like, if it's a windy day, it's like spinning around, and I'm like, I wonder what the other birds that are like, hey, what's this? What's this tecolote doing out here? And it's just like spinning around. I don't know. To me, I love being lectured while I'm high, as long as it's not about lame shit I hate. Oh, okay. You know what's super menstrual? Bloodborne. It's about moon cycles and female horror. There's literally a place called the Nightmare of Menses. Oh, okay. That's interesting. I don't think I've ever really heard of that before. Yeah, I don't know. That's interesting.
Cometa. Papalote.
This comes from the Nahuatl word meaning butterfly.
Yeah, papalote. I don't know, because I've also heard, I mean, again, papalote means butterfly itself too. But I'm trying to think, because there's other things I've heard it being called, but...
And there are some words from Nahuatl that are used across the Spanish-speaking world, including in Europe, since they represent items found in Mexico. The word for raccoon.
Mapache.
The word for chewing gum.
Chicle.
And this is also the source of the name of the chewing gum brand Chiclets.
So, the story behind how Americans discovered chewing gum, or chicle, is that chicle trees grow in, well, a lot of them are in Veracruz. And General de Santa Anna, who was the military commander during the U.S. invasion and theft of the northern territories, is that because he was from Veracruz, the state of Veracruz, and it has a history of like plantation farming. Like, that's really the only part of Mexico you can really do that, because it's too mountainous everywhere else. But anyway, the point being that they had chicle trees, and that they would give them like, and they actually do this still to this day. They will make like little like decorations. I mean, you're supposed to eat them, but they're like little flowers and like little houses, and it's made out of chicle. But the flavor isn't super strong like in America because they don't add in like whatever chemical effluent that they add into everything. As for the raccoon, I've never heard anyone else say mapache. Like I don't know what is that common to use in the rest of the Spanish people? I lost my Diva cup and I have no idea where it went. The other one my dogs chewed on and broke. Now I must order new cups and they're expensive. Oh my gosh. So that reminds me, I have a friend who legit is going like all over to like every Target in the like greater LA area, which is enormous, to find these like Stanley Cup things that they just like just buy a Stanley Cup, you know, like if you want one. But I don't know.
Chicle also refers to the raw material, gum from the sapodilla tree, from
There are no mapaches in here, so we just call it like that. Okay.
which chewing gum was originally developed. It has been chewed by indigenous people of Mexico and Central America since long before the arrival of Europeans.
But so they say that it was when General de Santa Anna was, like, if you see the famous painting, he's like lying down. The Santa Anna's lying down, and they say that that's when the Americans, the ones that were fighting for Texas independence, you know, whatever, blah blah blah. They say that that's when they discovered it. Like that's when they took chicle from Mexicans, and eventually, you know, Wrigley became, you know, a big thing, whereas like in Mexico it's always been like a localized product. But yeah, chicle, it's just like, and even like the sapodilla tree, like sometimes people would just call it the chicle tree, like itself, even though the sap is the chicle.
The word for peanut in Mexico, as well as in Honduras, is
Cacahuate.
in Spain, a variant form of that word is used.
Cacahuete.
In most other areas, the most common word is maní. This word came from the Taino language and used to be spoken in the Caribbean. Peanuts were exclusively found in the New World, which is why these words were borrowed from indigenous languages. Some such words.
Wait, so okay, so we say cacahuate. In French, they say cacahuete. What brand? The brand that became really famous was Wrigley's, but like but Chiclets is also really famous. But like honestly, I always like the little artisan ones just because they're like really cute. But I've only seen them sold in Mexico. I don't know.
Words made their way into English too.
Aguacate.
The word for avocado,
Cacao.
which entered English as cocoa.
Chile.
The word for chili, or chili pepper. The word for tomato.
Tomate. Tomatillo. Jitomate.
Okay, so in Mexico, you will hear jitomate because that's technically more like what the Nahuatl word was, jitomate. But like if you're talking about them as like like in a biological sense, you know, like in a that type of sense, like an agricultural, I guess you could say tomate, but I still always heard it being said jitomate. And Chile, I don't know, because like in the United States, it can be spelled Chili or Chile, depending. And aguacate. So, as I explained before, the word mole in Nahuatl means sauce, right? That's why, like, when people say, "Oh, I want mole," it's like, technically speaking, that means sauce in general, right? Like the word sauce, right? So when you have guacamole, right? That's because it's avocado aguacate mole, right? Guacamole, right? It's avocado sauce, technically speaking.
The way these words are used differs depending on the area.
Also, tomatillos and tomatoes are not, if I remember correctly, tomatillos are part of the nightshade family, actually. Could be wrong, but there's something with like their stalks and the casings, but like the fruit itself is fine, but they're not like tomatoes at all. Like, well, they are, but you know, anyway.
Country.
Also, oh yeah. So, okay, in central Mexico, no, I don't know about that. I've seen jitomate. Well, yes, jitomate is always the red ones. That's true. Tomatillo is the only one I've ever seen that's green and been referred to as anything that's green. Tomate, I don't know. I've never really seen that be a big thing. I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe because I've never encountered it. But I've been to like literally Guadalajara has the largest market in the entire Americas, and I've never seen tomate to describe jitomate, right? Because they're usually red, and then tomatillos are green. But I guess they could call it tomate verde. I don't know. I've never seen that personally.
Central Mexico, tomate is a green tomato, jitomate is a red tomato, and tomatillo
But yeah, jitomate means the red ones, like the Roma, the beefsteak, all those.
is a small one. But in Yucatan, for instance, tomate is a red tomato and tomate verde is a green tomato. One last word of Nahuatl.
Well, I don't. Yucatan is a whole different Kulturbund, right? Like very, very separate from the rest of Mexico, at least historically speaking. In fact, it was a country for 7 years at one point, because culturally speaking, it's always been very distinct from the rest of Mexico, right? Like once you cross the isthmus of Tehuantepec to the other side, which is the more Mayan-speaking side, which is also very much more indigenous too, because the two states, if I remember correctly, 2 states in Mexico are majority indigenous, and that is Oaxaca and Chiapas. And those two are like, one of them is on one side of the isthmus of Tehuantepec, and the other one is on the other side. So it's like, that's like the kind of like zone where it's like after that you begin to see more and more indigenous culture in general, and less like influence from colonial times, etc., etc. So but tomate, like again, in my experience, jitomate means the red ones. Tomatillo, they're small and green and encased, and you can make salsas diferentes, right? You can make different salsas, right? You can make una salsa roja, but that requires jitomates, right? But if you're gonna make una salsa como casera or de molcajete, right? Those usually use tomatillos, and you have to like roast them and then Anyway, so I'm not gonna give a cooking lesson.
Origin is chocolate. In Spanish,
chocolate.
Mexican slang.
Oh, here we go.
Mexican Spanish is well known throughout the Spanish-speaking world for its colorful slang. One word you'll probably hear is
Güey.
meaning something like
now people will spell it just Wey, because it's like, well, again, people do use it. Ay, güey, like they'll say it like that, but it's, I don't know. Like again, on Twitter, for example, I just see it being spelled We sometimes, like way. But yeah, way does exist as a word, yes.
like mate, bro, or dude. The word literally means ox and used to be used as an
Well, because the word buey means ox. Way is related to, so it's, anyway.
insult, but now it's used as a term of endearment. Well, at least in Mexico. One expression you'll probably hear is
¿Qué onda?
meaning what's up,
¿Qué onda, güey?
nada,
¿Qué padre?
meaning that's great, or
Oh, I see. I hate when they do these like weird little dialogue trees because sometimes they're so cringy. Like I'm just like, nobody talks like this, right? I'm like, nobody actually has conversations like this. But I guess like I mean, ¿qué onda? That's like. But again, it's not like, it's very informal, right? Like you wouldn't, like you wouldn't go up to your grandparents and be like, ¿qué onda? Like that's. Like it comes off naturally for me personally because but it's like I wouldn't speak to my parents this way, right? Like I wouldn't be like, ¿qué onda? That's not, I don't know. And ¿qué padre? I don't know, for some reason I just find it weird when they just add ¿qué? Because usually I just say, like, people would just say padre, or chido, right? Like they would just say the word itself, not ¿qué padre? right? Like that's, I don't know. It's just maybe I just use slang differently.
How wonderful. Padre literally means father.
Chido.
This word means cool.
Tú son.
So apparently the dictator in El Salvador, I know saying it like that. Well, because he calls himself like on his Twitter, he calls himself like the most popular dictator ever or something like that. I forget what he said, but Nayib Bukele, right? He started or like the wallet, the digital the coin wallet is called Chivo, and that is the El Salvadorian variant, I guess, of Chido. So, because Chivo in Mexico just means goat. So in a weird way, it's like they're saying the goat, but it's like, in a different sense.
Sombrero está muy chido.
Your hat's really cool.
Yes.
A huevo.
Hell yeah. This
Well, again, like sometimes it can mean like that, hell yeah, but it also can be like a kind of like a huevo, like vamos a ir a la tienda, and ay, pero estoy cansado, pero a huevo vamos a ir, it can be used differently. I'll just put it like that. Like, this is why I don't like these dialogue trees. A caballo.
expression containing the word for egg is used in many different Spanish-speaking countries. But
Also, if you're gonna talk about eggs, just be careful. Just especially in the plural. Just saying.
with various meanings. In Mexico in particular, it's used like this to show happiness or to celebrate something. And just like
Yeah, like you can say like a huevo. Like yes, you can say that, but it's not. You can also say it in a negative sense, like and another one. I don't know if they'll mention it, but they're like ponte las pilas. Oh my god, growing up I hated that. Like ponte trucha, ponte las pilas. I hated that. I don't know why. I think it's because I was like, because pilas means batteries, and I'm just like this weird like, what do you mean ponte las pilas? But anyway, it's like, that's like. Yeah.
Like hell yeah in English, it can be used to
Oh wait, what do you use to? A huevo? Or despabila?
emphatically show agreement.
La neta.
This means
Okay. But I have seen other people use como la verdad or la historia neta de blah blah blah, right? Like, but but like if you're having a conversation, you will hear like I'm thinking of a conversation I had recently when I was in Mexico City. It was like, neta, güey, mira, neta, a mí no me gusta ir a ese restaurante porque está muy trimberiche, and I'm just like, okay, and I'm just like, okay, like, whatever, right? And I'm like, okay, but you will, but like young people, they'll be like, neta, güey, te voy a decir, mira. Like, I'm just remembering my own friends. Like,
Neta.
for real.
Like
It
neta.
can also be used to describe people in a good way.
Eres la neta.
You're the best.
Yeah, but the one, ponte las pilas. Oh yeah, ponte trucha, ponte. Memories. Because that's something that's something that's linked to machismo. At least in Mexico it is. Like when you say ponte trucha, ponte, like all that stuff, it's like saying like, quote unquote, man the fuck up, right? Like that's like, grow a pair. It's like that type of language, but it's also in the like ponte las pilas, like, like stop being a, idiot essentially. But the one thing I like about Mexican Spanish is that, well, Spanish in general, is we can say el mero mero. Eres el mero mero. And it kind of doesn't make sense, but it does make sense. Like, at least.
Órale.
This word's used in many situations. It expresses amazement.
See, when he words it like this, it sounds weird. Because it's like, I don't, like, I guess because it's like he's abstracting it, right? And it's kind of like you can use it to say like that, but I noticed Chicane people use that more. Like they say órale, like especially associated with like cholo culture. You'll see people saying like órale, like, or what is that place called that they're always talking about? Oh gosh. Oh. Okay. I don't go to Chick-fil-A, but I know some cholos. Well, I mean, I live in the Mexican neighborhood, so of course there's cholos here. But anyway, they're very cool people. I mean, they're great. You know, nice people. Anyway, at least to me. I mean, you know, they're. But anyway, they will say like, "We're gonna go to Chick-fil-A." You know, like, it's such a Chicano thing. Like, we're gonna go to Chick-fil-A. Like, there's just this accentation that's just like so Chicano. That's just like it kind of like it rose from northern Mexican Spanish dialects, right? But like now it's taken its own, and I just remember like every time that this person, I won't say their name, but it's like, oh, you know, I really want to go get some Chick-fil-A. I'm just like, bruh, like, no. but he will be like, órale, you know. ¿Qué es lo que vamos a ir a hacer para, you know, órale, mira, ya es la mañana, and, you know, anyway, I don't want to just...
It's enthusiasm or agreement.
But yeah,
with what someone
órale, you
has said.
usually see that in Chicano.
Aguas.
This means watch out or be.
Oh yeah, aguas. Oh gosh, this is the way how I most normally hear it is échame aguas. Échame aguas, which means like which means like usually it's used in the context of like when you're backing up a car, at least in my life, when you're backing up a car, like my dad would be like, you know, échame aguas, right? Which means like look and make sure that there are no cars coming, right? Like be alert for danger, right? Like échame aguas, tell me if danger is around. You know? So anyway, so there's that.
Careful.
Chela. Cheve.
These words both mean beer.
Pedo.
This
So andaba bien pedo, güey. Yeah, that's yeah. Yes. Chela, you know. There's also another one that's like a specific type of beer, though, and that's a caguama. That's a very I don't know why, but I'm just like right now I'm in this kind of like, oh yeah, I never really realized just how like, you know, like all of these little intricacies of Mexican stuff, because caguama means like a sea turtle, but caguama also means this like big ass beer that you buy and that you put like spicy stuff in like the glass and anyway, like a caguama anyway. But yeah, oh no, anoche estaba bien pedo, like that. Yes, that means drunk, yes, but it also means fart too, so yes.
This word literally means fart, but it has many different uses and meanings. And sometimes it means drunk.
Está bien pedo.
Yeah.
This means he's really
It's
drunk.
just weird hearing
And
it in these
again,
weird,
that
like,
bien
detached
is
ways.
used to mean really or very. Pedo is also used in,
¿Qué pedo?
which is like que onda.
But remember, these are in very informal and usually, like, I don't want to say it's almost like Japan, because I know you don't want to compare a very strict hierarchical, right? Like, it's not the same in Mexico. But, like, even growing up, like, you're not supposed... This is something that's kind of an issue... Not an issue, but, like, a big difference between Chicanos and Mexicanos, right? Because Chicanos are seen as... Like, there's a book I actually have called the México de Afuera. That's how they see Chicanos, right? But Mexicanos... Like, in Mexico, you're never supposed to look... Like, in America, you're always supposed to look people straight in the eye. Right? In Mexico, that's seen as rude. Right? Like, if they are above you, right, in status, right, in age and status, whatever, you don't look at their eyes. And you wouldn't say words like this, right? Like, you wouldn't say que pedo to your grandfather. Right? I mean, I guess it depends on your grandfather. But you know what I mean, right? So it's like, there are these, like... It has to be within a certain age range that it has to be said, but it's not as strict as, say, the Japanese, right, where it's like system exactly, right? But there is like you wouldn't say this to parents, you wouldn't say this to teachers, you wouldn't say this to, like, I remember when I went to my like Mexican ass school here in LA. Like, I remember, like, there was this one white math teacher, and they kept trying to make her say vato, right? Like, oh. And I'm just like, can we not do this? Like, the last thing we need to do is literally have a Karen, like, emblematic Karen figure, of the of the school, right? The one white math teacher, to be saying, orale vatos, like that's no, like she's gonna she's gonna get into problems if y'all do that to her, like. So I was always like, don't do that.
Madre.
This is the word for mother, but it has all sorts of slang uses. Too many to get into here. For example,
Me valen madres.
this means
Right. I know, it's just hilarious because they always wanted to make her say like stupid shit. It's always all like it's always like, oh, like I'm gonna just call her Karen. It's like, hey, yo, Miss Karen, like you like lowriders, They'll be like, and then they'll start talking about like, oh, my mom, she's like one of those OGs, she's over there with the M&Ms, and then people are like, what the fuck? like that is like, if you know what I just said, if you know, so But they were always trying to make her say like bad shit, like, oh, oh gosh. It was funny at the time because but at the same time I was also like, let's not do this because I'm thinking like she has to exist in the Chicano space, in the Mexicano space. If she says that to the wrong person, right? If she says like dumb shit to the wrong person, like you never know, especially like the way how white people are, like they like to take words that are okay for Mexicans to use, and same thing with like black people, for example, and like think that, oh well, I'm using it in the same context you are. It's like, no, you're not, because you're not, so anyway. But usually it's usually me vale madre. Like when you say that, that's like I don't fucking care, like at all. Like that's like me vale madre si voy a la escuela hoy. Like that means like I don't give a fuck, like at all. It's not just I don't care. Like you don't bring up a mother. You don't bring up mothers unless it's like an ultimatum, okay? Like that's like it's the highest thing. Like me vale madre si eso, because that's like if as soon as you mention mothers, that's like negation of like the negation of the negation of Hegel is me vale madre, like
I don't care, but it's quite emphatic. More like I don't give a
exactly, I don't give a fuck.
Con madre.
This means something like awesome, but literally it means with mother.
Qué poca madre tienes.
These are like comadre. Like if you hear comadre, that means something different. That means like, oh, you're like my best friend. Yeah, I really don't hear con madre to mean awesome. Like, you'll hear like, oh, qué padrísimo, qué chido, stuff like that. You don't really see comadre, like, cause it's too close, but comadre y compadre, like all that stuff. Like that, I mean, like, trust me, I'm compas with a lot of people, okay? I'm compas with a lot of people. I'll just put it like that. Me vale tula, me importa un pico. Yeah, it's the pretty vulgar equivalent. I mean, like, you can say the even more obscene ones, which involves whipping out something, right? Me vale. But I won't be whipping it out today. But que poca madre tienes, like, I've heard it. There are better ways to say that. Like, I don't know. I just feel like mugroso, like to me, I just think like puerco, mugroso. Like that means you have no shame. Like I just feel like yes, these are generally true, but also like the language has evolved, is like even more, has so many other uses, like, oh gosh, like que poca madre tienes, like, yes, that means you have no shame, but it also can be like a way to say like you're dumb, right? Like,
This means you have no shame. Its literal translation is more like what little of a mother you have.
again, as soon as mothers are brought up, You know, you've reached the peak. That's like,
Mexican slang is well known for its crude words and expressions, which can be shocking to other Spanish speakers, and can be shocking to other Mexicans in the wrong context.
exactly.
Include
Like, you wouldn't say anything that was just said in a formal context at all. Like, this is like the most informal stuff possible. Like, this is like stuff you say when you're like 12 and 13 and shit. Like, once you get older, you know, you will say like, well, like, me vale madre, blah, blah, blah. But like, you won't say as much of like, oh, que padrísimo, you know, like, you don't really hear that as much like once you get older. I don't know. It's like, those are like middle school kid stuff. I don't know. At least I don't know.
Putting those words here might get me in trouble. So I've actually cut this part of the video and put it into a separate secret video that you can find in the description down below.
Is it over?
Mexican Spanish is fascinating because of its expressive nature and its unique flavor. In many ways, it's representative.
Why do white people always have to talk about like, oh, it's zesty, it's spicy, it's flavor, it's anytime it's something, anything that's Latino, anything that has to do with Latino America, it's always like, oh, they're so feisty, they're so spicy, they're so this, and it's just like, bro, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, no, we're just normal people. Normal people. Stop trying to fit us into this weird box of those like feisty, hot-headed, whatever. It's like, I don't understand. Like, I never understood that. Like, why they, but it's part of the, you know, the racism, right? But it's just like that, using this language to describe Spanish as like, I'm not saying that Paul is wrong in doing this. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying people that like to describe it in these ways don't realize that they're actually kind of being offensive when they're doing that. Like, at least in my opinion. Like, I don't know, maybe it's different for people that live in, but like in America they love to like equate heat, spice, you know, sensual things, right, with Spanish speakers, right? While at the same time, you know, anyway, it's just like a weird imperialist racist thing.
Of the ways in which Latin American Spanish is different from European Spanish, but it's also special because of the influence of Nahuatl, and to a lesser degree other indigenous languages. And as we saw towards the end of the video, Mexican Spanish makes an impression. The question of the day, to speakers of Mexican Spanish, what other features of your variety of Spanish do you want us to know about? Write them in the comments down below. And to speakers of other varieties of Spanish, what do you think when you hear Mexican Spanish? What's your impression of it? Leave your comments down below. If you want to improve your Spanish,
Okay, we don't need to do the ad. We don't need to do the ad, okay? So, what do we think about Mexican Spanish? Do we like it? No. Like I said, a lot of it's contextual, and a lot of it's like depends on who you're talking to, when you're talking to them. Like, honestly, I know people who like never use a lot of slang. But that's also because of a weird cultural thing that happens in America, where there is this view, and in fact, this is why the word pocho, which nobody should use unless you're Chicano, that term, right, is supposed to be a derogatory term, right? Like, that's a derogatory term from Mexicans from Mexico, right? Mexicanos against Chicanos, right? Like, that is, I mean, it's also the title of a book, Pocho. I mean, now it's been reclaimed to a great degree, but I still, you know, like, I still have heard people call Chicano people these negative terms before, like recently, like just a few weeks ago. So because there's this weird distinction between like, well, we're OG Mexicans because we come from the motherland, I guess, but you guys are like something else, right? And this is a huge issue, you know, I'm not gonna go into it too much, but it's like, even Mexican Spanish, like thinking about it in context, I'm thinking, well, the Chicano additions to this make it even more vast than just what was just talked about in this video. But so what do we think, especially since we have other Spanish speakers? Also, hi Moni, it's so good to see you. Yes, knowledge, yeah. I know, I'm always like I know I'm never gonna be like, oh, you know, have like a whole bunch of, you know, people like Hassan, right? Like, because I don't, you know, but I still like just talking about like what I know, you know, just stuff that I think is interesting, because I think that's the best way to go about it when it comes to streaming. Plus, I think you can make more connections that way if you're just like yourself, right? Anyway, so I'm thinking about those guajolotas now. Now I'm like, oh, I'm gonna go back to Mexico City. I'm gonna go get some guajolotas. So we're gonna raid No Comment Chick. Thank you so much for joining me for this stream. I hope you enjoyed it. But like I said, we're gonna raid. Everyone get in the machine, and we are gonna go say hello to Irene. Make sure to send lots of Giga Chads, and tell her that I'll be right there in a little bit, because I have to go make some lunch. Okay, bye everyone. Thank you so much for joining me.